Oliver, and this is Deep Cuts, a channel dedicated to music for lovers of music. So, first video of the new Deep Cuts era. In case you missed the video from a few days ago, I'm back. I'm going to be posting a video once a month on the YouTube channel, and I've also launched a Substack where I'm going to be posting content every single week. The link's in the top right corner if you want to go and subscribe to that. On Saturday, I posted a piece on my favourite records of 2025 so far, and tomorrow, in celebration of Fugazi's Red Medicine turning 30, I've done an interview with none other than Joe Lally, Fugazi's legendary bassist. So I'll post that up tomorrow. If you go and subscribe today, you'll get that in your inbox tomorrow. Please do check that out. I had a lot of fun interviewing him. And next week, once you've had a chance to digest this mammoth guide, you'll be able to go and read my interview with Adam Steiner, who wrote Into the Never, which is a great book on the creation of the downward spiral. I would really implore you to go and check this book out, but do please subscribe to go and read that interview. We didn't just talk about the downward spiral, we talked about lots of other facets of Reznor's legacy, some of the soundtracks that he's done. Yeah, lots of really interesting stuff. As I said in my launch video, paid subscribers of the Substack will help me carve out more time in my life to make more YouTube content, more Substack content, more music content in general. So, you know, if you support this channel and you want to continue to see me do this stuff on a regular basis, that's hugely helpful. I really appreciate it. So, on to the main event, a Deep Cuts guide to 9 Inch Nails. With 2025 seeing the groundbreaking band return to the live stage with its Peel It Back World Tour, I thought this is a perfect time to finally publish this guide. I did also start writing it half a decade ago, so it's sort of long overdue. We're talking countless records, EPs, live albums, film and game soundtracks, all contributing to the legacy chiefly built by one man, Trent Reznor. For those relatively unfamiliar with 9 Inch Nails, the band is Reznor. While it's true he would come to surround himself with a healthy roster of collaborators, with one of those becoming an official member of the project in 2016, Trent is 9 Inch Nails and 9 Inch Nails is Trent. In these records, you'll find some of that abrasive aggression, the synthesis of rage and frustration through rock and electronic styles that edge onto industrial. If you need a primer on industrial, you don't really know much about industrial music, I did do a video on 5 hours to get you into industrial about 1,000 years ago. So the link is in the description if you want to go and watch that. There's the lyricism concerned with alienation, despair, self-immolation, metaphorically, not literally, although maybe literally. But Reznor's music hasn't existed in stasis. It's not a mere copy of some of those early industrial greats like Skinny Puppy and Ministry, although those influences are there. There are incredibly powerful moments of dark ambience, for example. There is a surrendering to the dance floor with some of the infectious driving rhythms, and even a slightly more optimistic glimpse of a world beyond the neurosis and the muck and the darkness. All these things are well known and loved by 9 Inch Nails fans across the world. If you don't know much about 9 Inch Nails, then hopefully this guide will go some way to helping you get into them a little bit more. If you are a 9 Inch Nails fan, I'd love to know what your favourite records are. Do let me know in the comments section and let's talk about it like we always do. Trent Reznor was born in Pennsylvania in 1965 as Michael Trent Reznor. You can see why he dropped the Michael for the stage name. Not very rock and roll really, is it? Sorry to any Michaels who may be watching. He studied trumpet, sax, and piano. It came really natural to me, knowing that I was good at something played an important role in my confidence. I was always shy, uncomfortable around people. I slipped by, but with music, I didn't. By the sounds of it, he wasn't a kid that was wearing all black and skulking around the school corridors, not speaking to anyone. Like, in fact, he was playing in the school's jazz and marching bands and apparently was fairly popular. Fun fact, he also played Judas in the school production of Jesus Christ Superstar. That was one of the things I did in my sixth form as well. I was in the pit band, and maybe one of the most fun things I've ever done. Like, don't sleep on Jesus Christ Superstar. It is good. One of his former musical band directors described him as friendly and upbeat, and sort of suggested that dark persona that he's cultivated over the years was in essence a good marketing tactic to help build his career. And while that is in part true, the music he would bring into the world is at times inky black. It's tightly wound with this pervasive despair, and at no point, to my mind, does it feel as if it's been engineered for disingenuous intentions. No, if you travel down the pockmarked road of this discography, you will find the way paved with sincerity. Like, this is a sincere artist, I think that's fair to say. And yes, it is dark, but his music at turns is also moving and euphoric, and it brings a legion of loyal fans who could find no greater fix than 9 Inch Nails. So not a bad childhood, but a sheltered one, and that's something that he's acknowledged in the past. There was nothing going on but the cornfields. Moving to Cleveland, Ohio to try and make it in the music industry. He was involved in numerous bands like The Innocent and Exotic Birds. I've linked to an Exotic Birds record that Trent was on in the description if you would like to hear that. Eventually, he got a job as a cleaner and assistant engineer at a Cleveland studio, and in his spare time, he started using the studio to build these demos that would form the basis of a debut record. Now, before we jump into the first Nine Inch Nails record, 1989's Pretty Hate Machine, I guess we're kind of already there because I've said it now. I want to look at some of Trent's musical influences because I think this is in part why he's such a difficult artist to pigeonhole. You know, there's a lot of diversity in the output that he's had over the decades, and some of these influences I think are why. David Bowie, of course, becoming a collaborator with the man in the 90s, My Bloody Valentine, Jesus and the Mary Chain, Cabaret Voltaire, Coil, Depeche Mode. See, in that list you have mainstream pop brilliance rubbing up against more caustic, challenging types of music, and in a way that's the best way of describing Trent's musical talents. So he signed with Steve Gottlieb's TVT Records, which is now defunct and gave rise to a contested professional feud, which we'll get to in a minute. But now let's talk about this record. What a belter of a debut album. Pretty Hate Machine, or Halo 2. What do you mean Halo 2? Well, so there's a whole numbering system with all the Nine Inch Nails releases, so everything has a corresponding number, so Halo whatever, and then the number. So Halo 1 was actually the first single, Down In It, which is a track that's on Pretty Hate Machine, and then Pretty Hate Machine itself is Halo 2. At the time, Pretty Hate Machine was a snarling enigma. It burst onto the music scene like this pumped up, slightly more accessible successor to the more nihilistic industrial groups that had paved the way in the 80s up until then. If you want another primer on industrial, don't forget 5 albums to get you into an industrial video in the description. That's the second time that I've plugged that now. I'm going to quit while I'm ahead. Playing all of the instruments himself and producing alongside the legendary Flood, those synth pop influences are there just as much as the slightly more abrasive industrial stuff, with titanic riffs and memorable hooks dragging Reznor into the limelight and selling more than 1 million copies. Opening track Head Like a Hole showcases all of that right from the off, beginning with those big drum samples and snaking bass synth, and then you have the chorus filled with these thin, nasty, distorted guitar chords. Reznor's baritone vocal is and always will be such a core proponent of the Nine Inch Nails sound, except on the instrumental soundtrack work, obviously. Especially in these early days where he sounds anguished and unrelenting at the same time, as if these words are just bursting out of him. And in this very early instant, you've got lyrics speaking to a generation fearing a loss of freedom and wanting to reject conformity. Head like a hole, black as your soul, I'd rather die than give you control. And for all the bite that the vocals, the drum samples and the guitars have, there are also moments of danceable groove. Down In It is, dare I say, almost playful. You can almost imagine Trent doing a little break dance whilst he's performing it. What an image. But right in the middle of this record, the first track that he wrote for Pretty Hate Machine is Something I Can Never Have. Taking the prototypical pop theme of unrequited love and turning that into a smouldering horror score was a stroke of genius. Down to that semi-tonal piano motif that sounds like John Carpenter. You've got the sparing, distorted, reverbed drums, and then you've got Trent's quiver in his vocals when he sings "And I'm starting to scare myself." What a hint to the future of the Nine Inch Nails sound this track is. The track Sin again marries repetitive electronic dance beats to melodies and vocals that are trying to unsettle, which again can be heard in that collision in the closing track Ring Finger. The record took off in a way that label boss Steve Gottlieb had not expected, and apparently he called this album an abortion when he first listened to it. Though this is a comment that Steve vehemently denies in an in-depth Billboard interview, which I have linked down in the comment section. After touring the record and seeing the success in record sales, he jumped back into the studio to record an EP, 1992's Broken. One of my favourite EPs, so furious, so corrosive. It waves goodbye to the slightly radio-friendly stylings of Pretty Hate Machine and basically batters the listener for about half an hour. In an interview in '94, Reznor said, "When I put Broken out, I thought I'd alienate every one of my fans, and I think subconsciously I wanted to." Now we need to quickly talk about the guitar sounds of Nine Inch Nails because it's such an important part of the sound. If you listen to that pummeling opening track Wish on this EP, notice how direct and pointed the guitar sounds are, almost as if they've had that nice rounded warmth of a guitar valve amp sucked out of them. Well, that's because Trent doesn't really use guitar amps in recording. You know, for a band that relies so heavily on the distorted electric guitar sound, on this EP the guitars were recorded on a Zoom multi-effects pedal or preamp, and then basically put straight into the computer interface and then just layered over and over again. This is a practice that he continued after this EP, although the equipment might have got better quality. You know, it's quite inspiring in a way to know that you can create something quite so hostile without a stack of amplifiers. Bedroom musicians rejoice. It kind of makes a lot of Trent's guitar tracks, especially in the early days, almost sound like uncanny valley versions of guitar distortion, like an approximation of distortion, because it has that hint of synthetic sound about it. And that's not a criticism, it just makes some of the heavier sections of Nine Inch Nails music sound more interesting. And case in point, the track Last's riff is paired so well with Trent's almost screaming vocals, while Happiness in Slavery is pure Gen X nihilism, you know, fear of control through a homogeneous ruling power. Every damn instrumental line on this thing is, you know, distorted to the point where it's almost glitching out into white noise. It was also released with a pretty grim black and white music video of a guy being tortured and murdered, which was banned by MTV, unsurprisingly. If you do want to go and see that, head to Vimeo, but you know, content warning. All of that coupled with an EP that includes the lyric fist fuck, and you have a band pushing the boundaries of what's acceptable and what's taboo in the music industry. And it's all the more uncomfortable because Nine Inch Nails had captured a lot more mainstream attention than a lot of other bands around that time that were doing similar things. Also worth a look is follow-up EP Fixed, which is a reimagining of some of the tracks on Broken. So how would widespread attention reckon with music that challenged preconceptions and sought to take the listener downward on a journey into self-destruction and despair? In 1994, Nine Inch Nails' second full-length record was released, The Downward Spiral. I'd wager that every single one of you has at least heard of this record. It's one of the biggest records of the 90s, both commercially and critically, and it really did skyrocket Trent Reznor into the limelight even more than Pretty Hate Machine had done before it. As we have a limited time to get into every facet of this album, and there is so much to explore on it, I would again really recommend you check out Into the Never, book by Adam Steiner, Nine Inch Nails and the Creation of the Downward Spiral. It's a really interesting book. It's like 200 pages just on this record, so much context and history in there. Really, really good. And again, if you would like to read my interview with Adam, I'm going to be posting that on the Substack next week, and we'll be talking about this record, but also lots of other Nine Inch Nails stuff. I've also added a link in the description so you can purchase that book directly. The Downward Spiral is at turns one of the more uncomfortable and personal records that you're likely to hear. It's true that depression and addiction had begun to seep into Trent's life, and those cloying themes, definitely present on Broken and Pretty Hate Machine, are no longer flourishes or an exploration. The music on Downward Spiral fed on Reznor's precarious mental state and his own murky perceptions on life, on being controlled, feeling like a useless pawn in a society where power is routinely abused. Some have also said that this theme was fed by his fractious relationship with TVT Records. Trent threw everything at the Downward Spiral, working day and night to birth it into the world. Speaking to RIP magazine back in the 90s, he said, "I've become a workaholic just because I have nothing else to do. As long as I keep working, I don't have to deal with every other aspect of my life." Probably not helped by his new studio in LA home on Cielo Drive, which happened to be the very house where Sharon Tate was murdered by the Manson family in 1969. This is the place that Trent chose to shut himself away from the glitz of Beverly Hills to make this dark piece of art. Conceptually, there are links to this record and Sharon Tate's murder, you know, even if it's tangentially. You know, Sharon Tate's murder came in 1969 at the end of the swinging 60s, so it was the end of that free love idealism. The crumbling American dream was ever more apparent. You know, it's its own kind of nationwide downward spiral. It's important to say that Trent isn't some kind of serial killer loving Fruit Loop, and that has been the way he has been portrayed about this in the past, and I think it's been rolled back on over the years. But I think some of that fascination came from the loss of morality that happened as a result of this tragedy, and how the nation was so shook by this tragedy that had happened. He later said in 97 that he didn't idolize Charles Manson in any way, and he actually met Sharon Tate's sister, which had reminded him of the real world consequences that this tragedy had, you know, beyond the myth making of the Manson family and all the rest of it. Anyway, this record sounds like it could have been released yesterday. yesterday. It's transgressive, at times violent and claustrophobic, but also littered with these more muted, subtle moments. His songwriting had morphed from Broken and Pretty Hate Machine to something that has more dynamic contrast, which makes The Downward Spiral a far more rounded piece of work. Inspired by Bowie's Low, probably my favourite Bowie record, he created a semi-autobiographical concept of a man sinking into his own personal abyss, travelling from anger and defiance to eventually dejection, self-destruction, and suicide. And Reznor uses everything in his arsenal so far to depict this. On opening track Mr. Self-Destruct, there's these pummeling guitar samples, and the guitar sound would not sound out of touch on the Broken EP, as Reznor spits, "I take you where you want to go. I give you all you need to know. I drag you down, I use you up. Mr. Self-Destruct." Samples are used throughout this record. The first one that you hear is from THX 1138, George Lucas's film, which is about kind of oppression and control, and it's that theme once again as you hear this prisoner being beaten. We also have a collaboration from Adrian Belew on this record. Yes, of King Crimson and David Bowie fame. Despite coming from very different musical spheres, the pair actually work together very well, pushing each other outside of their own respective comfort zones. And Adrian became a frequent collaborator of Nine Inch Nails' work, as we'll see throughout this video. Second track Piggy wrongfoots the listener after that first track with a softly crooning Reznor, a clean bass motif, and a very slightly shuffled drum beat. Far less brash and in your face, but all the more sinister sounding for it. It's a brilliant track. The lyrics have been interpreted as a reaction to Richard Patrick, who was nicknamed Piggy, leaving the band in '93 before the recording of The Downward Spiral. That unsettlingly loud drum performance in the second half of the track is actually performed by Trent himself, and I think is the only time that he has played drums on a Nine Inch Nails recording. Speaking of drums, March of the Pigs gets off to a ferocious start with the percussion thrashing through this 7/8 time signature, very intense, sharp guitars, and Trent's angry squall rallying against society's gluttony for superficial slop. But this track on a first listen is surprising. Out of nowhere from this brash intensity, you get this solo piano motif in major key with Trent singing over the top of it. And the rest of the brashness is gone. And before you know where you are, all of a sudden the band bursts back in, thrashing into the song. Next track, Closer, was a huge crossover success, landing in charts across the world with its funky wah bass line, its mid-tempo four-to-the-floor drums, and surely the only track to chart which has the lyrics, "I wanna fuck you like an animal." There's also a remix of this track called Closer to God, which leans even further into those dance music stylings. In Adam's book, he talks about how Trent knowingly sabotaged and subverted the airplay potential of Closer by including this line. But that actually didn't stop the radio edit, sans the word fuck, being a huge hit in dance and rock charts across the world. Every track is perfectly placed. The razor sharpness of the guitars and Trent's scream on I Do Not Want This, the bubbling ambience of A Warm Place, the trudging heaviness of Reptile in its near 7-minute glory, all leading to Hurt, a finale bearing the soul of the artist, the protagonist of this dark concept which is threaded through the record. The croon on Piggy returns, but it's more damaged and dejected than before, and it's joined by an acoustic guitar motif that subtly cuts in and out like an interrupted signal. This is hands down one of the most beautiful songs Reznor has ever recorded, building to this final release as he sings, "And you could have it all, my empire of dirt. I will let you down, I will make you hurt." Reznor on the song. It's the last song. This sounds totally cheesy, but it was so fucking heavy when we were in the studio doing it. It was intense. I knew it meant a lot to me to write that because I was sort of excited and I had goosebumps. So I just put it on the record and thought it made a nice ending to a gloomy little song before I killed myself. So does the end act as a suicide note for the character, or is it defiance at the spiral, vowing to end it once and for all by living life? The track was of course covered years later by Johnny Cash in a very different style. You should go listen to that if you haven't heard it. The link's in the description. For a record that at times is so insistent and challenging, it debuted at #2 on the Billboard 200. And then it went on to be platinum and sold millions of copies across the world. It's a reminder of the curious position that Nine Inch Nails occupies in the world of music. Abrasion, a whiff of nihilism, the caustic qualities of its industrial forefathers, all packaged up into something which millions of people can enjoy and relate to. Wow. What a record. The following year, Trent released Further Down the Spiral, which is a reimagining of tracks off of the Downward Spiral, and it is worth listening to see what the reinterpretations are like of some of those songs. I personally enjoy the breakbeats on opening track Piggy. They remind me of the sort of breakbeats that David Bowie was experimenting with 2 years later on his Earthling record. In '97, Trent produced the soundtrack for the late great David Lynch's Lost Highway, possibly one of his best films, and it's a crowded market there, alongside original pieces from the late great Angelo Badalamenti, Smashing Pumpkins, Marilyn Manson, and from 9 Inch Nails you get The Perfect Drug, a great track that brilliantly employs an open hi-hat version of the famous Amen break. I actually thought it was the Amen break when I originally listened to it, but I'm pretty sure it isn't. Answers on a postcard, or more simply, answers in the comments section. I have linked to an absolutely classic YouTube documentary on the Amen break as well if you don't know what that is. So go and watch that as well. That's maybe the last time I'm going to mention Trent's soundtrack work on this video because, I don't know, we don't have 5 hours. There's so much of it. Once we get to 2010 and beyond, he is constantly working. You know, some of it's tangentially 9 Inch Nails, but, you know, we really don't have time to get stuck into all of that. But if you are working through the 9 Inch Nails discography as a result of this video, and then you want to go check out the soundtrack work with him and Atticus Ross, you definitely should do. Like, The Social Network is an all-timer, absolutely brilliant, and even recent ones like Pixar's Soul or even HBO's Watchmen. Anyway, this aside is kind of connected to where we're heading next, because ambient scapes and instrumental interludes will play a big part in the evolution of the 9 Inch Nails sound. Smash cut, it's September 1999, and 9 Inch Nails follows up the Downward Spiral with The Fragile. At turns bleak, often exhausting, and at times disarmingly beautiful. I wasn't that concerned if people who liked the Downward Spiral would like this, because I was a different person on this record than I was on Downward Spiral. I allowed myself to take the time to try things I wouldn't have done in the past. This is my personal favourite 9 Inch Nails record. It kind of has everything I want from Trent's music. It has his unique brand of industrial rock. It has introspective passages. It has electronic textures, orchestral flourishes, and moments with no lyricism at all. So how did Trent get here from the tightly wound coil of the Downward Spiral? Well, the success of that record resulted in an incredibly long and overextended world tour, at one point also even supporting Bowie, which is just a lineup I can't get my head around. He produced tracks for Marilyn Manson, a friendship which eventually went awry and became the subject of the song Starfuckers Incorporated, which is on the second disc of The Fragile. You can read about that feud elsewhere, because I really can't be asked to go into it. He'd basically just burnt himself out by the end of this tour, and he talked about how low he felt and how he was sick of his bandmates were sick of him. It just really wasn't a good vibe at the end of that tour. This resulted in a much longer period of experimentation in the studio, around 2 years, you know, to really kind of think about how else he could express himself musically and artistically, and this is the different sounds we start to get on The Fragile. I've linked to a video interview that he did in '99 where he talks about some of that process, and it's a really interesting and illuminating watch, so go check that out after you've watched all of this, obviously. But 5 years after the Downward Spiral, we get The Fragile. And from what I can read of critical opinions at the time, it was pretty mixed. Let us not forget the shocking Pitchfork review from Brent DiCrescenzo where he gave it a 2. I've linked to that particularly embarrassing piece of journalism below if you would really like to read it. He also wrote the really terrible Kid A review. If you know, you know. But it's largely been reappraised in the years since, and it's now seen as one of the most impressive statements of artistic intent produced by Trent Reznor. And for good reason. An hour and 45 minutes, 23 tracks, all killer no filler? To my mind, absolutely. Now, a different instrument type became key to Trent's repertoire on this record. In keeping with the idea of making everything sound a little broken, I chose stringed instruments because they're imperfect by nature. You can hear it in the lower registers of Le Maire or the finale of the entire record, Ripe with Decay. But it's also there in the opening track, Somewhat Damaged. You've got this acoustic guitar refrain in 3/4 that's just going da-da-da-da, da-da-da-da. It's a little bit imperfect as Trent describes it. There's some natural buzz from the string, and you can hear the tangible physicality of the instrument that you're listening to. Very quickly, the track builds with these heavy drums and really thin, distorted, palm-muted electric guitar. And the dejected mental state we heard in the Downward Spiral continues here. Broken, bruised, forgotten, sore, too fucked up to care anymore. What I've always liked about the opening of The Fragile is the 1-2 hit of those first two tracks. You know, Somewhat Damaged is basically a punch in the face. Cheers, Trent. While the beatless second track, The Day the World Went Away, to me always feels like the true opener of this expansive double album that's not just about the aggression. It goes from soundscape to heavy distorted guitar, then drops out for Trent's vocals, and at that point you start to hear things you haven't yet heard in the Nine Inch Nails sound yet. You get subtle tuned percussion, you get ukulele strums, this ever-present synth bed that's floating somewhere in the background. Ending on these group vocals, it's kind of hard to articulate. It's anthemic, but not maybe in the traditional way. You can imagine this song being chanted by thousands of people in a stadium setting, which makes sense as this has become a pretty standard staple of their live sets since 1999. Here and there are moments across the record which revel in those quieter moments, these oases of calm, like the piano-led track The Frail, which leads into that electronic pulse and aggressive bursting on The Wretched. As you listen to this record, hopefully you'll be really appreciating the sequencing. It feels as if every track has a sense of place and purpose on the record, flowing into one another in a really clear way. It never peters out or loses its energy. Like the title track of The Fragile into the incredible build of Just Like You Imagined, one of my absolute favourite moments. And much of that is down to Trent's obsessive sequencing on this record. He employed Bob Ezrin, a producer who's worked on an embarrassment of classic records, but perhaps most notably here, Pink Floyd's The Wall. Bob helped him sift through all the tracks on the Fragile sessions and work out what the sequencing should be. I called him into the room, tried not to have him read my face, and said, "Bob, you did it, man." He said, "I know." He gave me a hug and said, "I have a flight to catch. See you later." What a legend. The first disc ends with The Great Below, to my mind one of the most stirring pieces Nine Inch Nails has ever released. Beatless until the outro, this mosquito-like synth line leads Trent's vocals, which are talking about the world and his place in it or lack thereof, as the sonic palette grows steadily larger, building up to this section switch up, which just is so emotive, all resulting in this climactic moment where Trent sings, "And I descend from grace in arms of undertow. I will take my place in the great below." And we haven't even covered the second disc yet. So disc 2, or Right as it's sometimes known, has been described by Trent in the past as the ghost of the first record, so the aftermath after everything is broken. And it's hard to disagree there. Everything gets more experimental and abstract in nature, traditional song structures are adhered to even less than on the first disc. The Way Out is Through languishes in these synth lines and electronic textures before fading into this heavy as shit full band refrain, complete with Trent screaming. The Mark Has Been Made is like a swaggering rock beat with molasses poured all over it. And closing track Ripe with Decay returns us to the foregrounding of that imperfect string sound that Trent was trying to get across on this record. It's slightly flat, it's dusty, it's wallowing in this gloopy soundscape, fading into reversed vocals and heavily treated drums that sound like they're coming up from the abyss. It's kind of an unwieldy record, right? It's not an easy listen. There's a lot to listen to in the first place. But to my mind, probably the best thing that's ever been released under the Nine Inch Nails moniker. And that is a discography full of highs, as you're going to continue to learn from this video. Let me know in the comment section if you agree. I'm sure there'll be many more people who prefer the Downward Spiral, which is also an incredible record, but you know, to my mind, this is the peak. Following The Fragile, we get what Nine Inch Nails fans would refer to as the wilderness years. There was a long time, between the Downward Spiral and The Fragile, but between The Fragile and its follow-up, yeah, we're going 6 years. In 2000, we get Things Fall Apart, which is a remix record that contains no less than 3 different versions of Starfuckers Incorporated. Not a huge fan of this release, you know, there's not loads that is essential to check out here, although I do like the track Metal, which is an often overlooked banger that you should check out. And in 2002, live album And All It Could Have Been was released. Definitely worth a listen. You know, if you haven't seen Nine Inch Nails live before, there is a real intensity to the way that they play. They give their all to these performances, and you get some of that on this record. We also get Still along with it, which is a collection of outtakes and remixes from the Fragile sessions. One of the most beautiful pieces on this release is Adrift and At Peace, which is a companion version of La Mer from the first disc of the Fragile. It's just a beautiful piano piece and, you know, a hint of what might come moving forward in Trent Reznor and Nine Inch Nails discography. On a personal level, at this point, Trent was a mess. After successive dark explorations thematically with the Downward Spiral and the Fragile, the incessant worldwide touring, the creeping poison of his drug addiction, he was essentially a crumpled mess on the floor. In 2001, when Fragile had wrapped on its tour, he said to himself, "You're gonna die if you don't stop this." He'd lost all respect for himself and he'd found his way into this particularly brutal kind of self-loathing. I remember thinking, what's the point? I've had everything I ever wanted in my life and I'm vomiting in the sink again. How did this happen? So yes, I hated myself. He also had a particularly nasty situation where he took a lot of what he thought was cocaine but ended up being heroin, which landed him in hospital in intensive care for a little while, and that was part of his wake-up call. So he kicked his drug addiction, an impressive feat for anyone. He tried to reconnect with friends and really didn't think about music too much for a little while, just tried to reconnect with life a little bit more. And it must have taken a hell of a lot of recalibration, not just, the kind of party lifestyle of being a rock star and the drugs and all the rest of it, but also those dark thematic explorations that he took on a Downward Spiral and the Fragile. It can't have been that easy to get back to a point where you felt healthy and alive and maybe slightly more optimistic than the places that art took you to. It wasn't until January 2004 that he started to sit down to write the follow-up to The Fragile, which became 2005's With Teeth, which coincidentally has just had its 20th anniversary. Fuck, I feel old. And if you're listening to this discography chronologically, you're about to listen to something very different to what came before. And that is absolutely connected to the fact that he wanted to get clean. He wanted to change his life, reconnect with friends, re-establish boundaries. And that's why With Teeth sounds the way it does. I felt my whole life up until that point had been swimming against the current. I came to realize what I was fighting for didn't make sense anymore. What nearly became a complex concept album about attaining sobriety became something a little bit more subtle than that, although as we'll see, some of those themes do seep into the tracks on With Teeth. What's most striking is the full-blown rebirth of Trent's songwriting. Coming from the experimental ambient passages of the Fragile, the instrumental sections, all of that exploratory space, comes this fucking tight modern rock record. I don't want to say conventional because that kind of sounds disparaging, but this record is pretty much wall-to-wall bangers, following a much more conventional song structure throughout, albeit still built with aggressive guitars, pounding drums, and those synths. It's worth returning to Trent's influences for a second to remind ourselves that despite the grit and the grime of his industrial flecked songwriting, he also had the utmost respect for artists like David Bowie, Depeche Mode, Queen. I learnt a lot from Jesus and Mary Chain about how to bury nice pop songs in unlistenable noise. The idea being, if you can get behind that wall you'd find, there's a pearl inside. Opening track All the Love in the World has always reminded me of like a lost trip-hop track. It has this dubby bass and halftime programmed drums. You've got this slow burn of an opening to this record. It added layers with the gentle synth pads and the piano that was such a big part of the previous record. The restraint of the track bubbles with the tension beneath it, as if daring the listener to think that the With Teeth title was somehow ironic. Then You Know Who You Are slams in with this propulsive 16th note drum beat courtesy of one Dave Grohl. You have Trent barking these lyrics, and then this heavy as an anvil chorus where the drums go half time, so the whole band really scoops in. Heavy distorted bass, synth and guitar backs up Trent as he screams, "Don't you fucking know what you are?" Fourth track, The Hand That Feeds, is probably one of the Nine Inch Nails songs most people could name. It's this strutting electro rock banger with a ridiculously catchy chorus that found itself in charts across the world. Just how deep do you believe? Will you bite the hand that feeds? Will you chew until it bleeds? Can you get up off your knees? These lyrics have been interpreted as a political diatribe, not uncommon in rock music of the mid-2000s. There was a lot of that around, and not surprising with the US waging war in the Middle East for dubious reasons and catastrophic consequences. And really, it returns us to the themes of power and control that we've seen throughout his discography. The overwhelming might of the system that subjugates us all, these topics that have coursed through Trent's writing since the late 80s. The record really drives forward from beginning to end, and for something that's nearly an hour long, really does zip by at a surprising rate. Every Day Is Exactly the Same is a brilliant song with the depth of the lyricism and the perfectly layered instruments. Grohl's drums thick like syrup, this pulsating synth
length going double time, and then you have Trent's lyrics reflecting on his time in rehabilitation. I can feel their eyes are watching, in case I lose myself again. Sometimes I think I'm happy here, sometimes yet I still pretend. This track took on a different significance for me during the pandemic. I remember standing in a supermarket queue for an hour listening to this song in my ears, and it felt very apt. Every day really was exactly the same. Anyway, great song, even if it does sound as if Trent is singing "I used to have a porpoise." Everything else here is brilliant too. The gallop of getting smaller, the static rumble of the line begins to blur, and the finale right where it belongs, which in the second half has this switch up that has a crowd sound fade in. I love this moment. This is like the triumphant return to the limelight for Trent Reznor after years of wallowing in addiction and pain, and the kind of wilderness years between The Fragile and With Teeth. He's finally back, making music he's proud of, and in front of a crowd who absolutely loves it. It's a poetic way to end an album. And don't skip version 2 that's on the special edition. I almost prefer that version of it, slightly different, a gorgeous guitar and bass rework of that song. Now healthy, happier, and any residual writer's block conquered, almost 2 years later, Trent Reznor follows up With Teeth with the next 9 Inch Nails album, Year Zero. A different beast entirely to what came before it. The modern rock sound of With Teeth is eschewed for this dystopian concept record that shows Trent's increasing interest in politics post-personal downward spiral, feeding into a sprawling narrative of the USA subjugating and drugging its society in the year of 2022. I guess back in 2007, that seemed like a long time ago. We'll get to the music in a second, but this concept went way beyond just the music. Trent collaborated with 42 Entertainment to create this alternate reality game, which was a series of sprawling websites unveiling details of this terrible fictional future. Basically a mashup of all of the dystopian literature you can think of, you know, Fahrenheit 451, 1984, Brave New World. I've left a link in the description to go and watch the rest of that video. It really demonstrates the scale of this concept and how far it was taken. You know, you even had fans finding USBs stashed in toilets with clues to like a secret gig, and there was all sorts of stuff going on. It was impressive and kind of fascinating. I don't remember a time that much effort has been put into a music release. There was even a touted TV show, but that ended up in development hell, unfortunately. I have to say that as a 15-year-old listening to this record and buying it, I don't really remember the concept around it at all. I think that entirely passed me by. I was able to enjoy the record and not really know about it. It was only years later that I read up about the 42 Entertainment work that Trent had done and all this secret stuff that had happened. I think it was all there. I just, I guess I wasn't as much of a fan back then. And it also proves that, you know, you don't have to have known about the concept to enjoy the music as well. At the risk of providing too many links in the description, this is becoming like fucking footnotes at this point. And there's a really in-depth Wired interview that Trent Reznor did where he talked about the ARG stuff and working with this team and how he was uploading snippets of tracks to the Pirate Bay and creating a breadcrumb trail for fans to follow. Really interesting stuff. Regardless of how the concept lands for you, this is another brilliant 9 Inch Nails record. And it's really interesting to hear Trent turn his hand towards something lyrically that sounds more like a protest record. This thing is full of the squalls of electronic noise, jagged textures cutting across sequenced drums and fuzzed out soundscapes. We talked about how With Teeth is a more conventional band setup following along from The Fragile. This is so different to that. Co-produced with his collaborator Atticus Ross, a lot of these tracks came together on Trent's laptop, and they'd only venture into the studio occasionally to record the occasional bit of live drum work or the brass and woodwinds on the track Capital G. Survivalism is one of the most rousing tracks in the entire of 9 Inch Nails' discography.
So just editing this video, realised it sounds as if I'm saying arousing. I wasn't saying arousing, I was saying rousing. But you know what, just so I don't make this mistake again in the future, to make you think as if I'm saying arousing, I'm never going to say the word rousing in a video again.
It's machine-tooled for a live setting. In the chorus, you have Trent's vocals multi-tracked, so he sounds like this band of rebels raising his fist in the air against the oppressive rulers and kind of committed to surviving whatever horrendous shit is going to face them next. I got my propaganda, I got revisionism. I got my violence in high-def ultra-realism. The serrated electronics are really at the front of the sound on this record. Vessel's descending stabs at the beginning of each bar just dominate the entire track, even Trent's voice. But I don't want to missell the sound of Year Zero or anything. It's not pure electronic experimentalism, and there are still some incredible choruses on this record, none less than My Violent Heart. The track begins sparingly with this softened drum sequence and a barely there bass line. Trent's basically whispering across the verse, and then when we get to the chorus, he shouts, "On hands and knees we crawl," and we get this really fuzzy bass, heavy as fuck drums, this squealing electronic noise that sounds like it's trying to escape the onslaught. The dynamics are part of what makes this work so well, and it's that classic quiet verse, loud chorus thing that you would have got in alt rock in the 90s. And I can't not talk about The Great Destroyer. On this track, the drums could not be further forward in the mix. Like, it's all you can really focus on as this song starts. Very attacking as a programmed drum line. The traditional kick is replaced with this very quickly decaying synth sound, hits you right in the chest. And halfway through, we get this beautiful moment where Trent's vocals are harmonized and he sings, "I am the Great Destroyer." And then out of nowhere, the drums from the beginning become even louder and just fill the entire mix. Like, if you listen back to the beginning of the song and then cut to the middle where this happens, you can hear how much louder the drums are mixed. And it's just an assault of noise, full on sonic oblivion, where everything in the track is being decimated using modular synthesis. As a side note, it was probably this Sherman filter bank that was used to make those sounds. I didn't know that. I'm not a genius. I had to look it up. But for those of you who are modular synthesis enthusiasts, then you probably already knew that. It's such a cathartic moment, and it's one of those moments in a song where like it just grooves so hard, but also sounds just so terrifying and brutal that you can't help but, once you've experienced the track, go back and listen again. Like, I remember when I first heard it and I was like, oh, I need to go back now, back to the middle of the track where Trent harmonizes, and it goes back into that section because it's just so good. Before we head into 2008, I have to mention Year Zero Remixed, which does what it says on the tin. There are some fascinating reworks on this release, like the opening track Hyperpower being renamed as Gunshots by Computer, and it features Saul Williams spitting bars over the top. One of my favorite ambient musicians, Finesse, creates a typically glitched out Bliss from In This Twilight, and an electro-pop version of The Beginning of the End by Ladytron. So let's dip into 2008, where the prolific output of this band shows no signs of stopping. In March of 2008, less than 12 months after we got Year Zero, we get Ghosts 1 to 4. Now, if you thought that the switch up in sound between The Fragile and With Teeth was surprising, or With Teeth to Year Zero, this is doubly so. Free of their label Interscope and able to put records out whenever they wanted, however they wanted, Trent released Ghosts 1 to 4 under the Null Corporation, which is his own new label. So what does he do to mark the occasion? 36 tracks, nearly 2 hours of delicious ambience, electronic textures, prepared piano sounds, tuned percussion, scapes to get lost in. Now, as a huge fan of ambient and instrumental music, you know this was right up my alley. Like, it had me written all over it. But to be able to switch on a dime from that fricative, piercing offering of Year Zero to the dark ambience of Ghosts 1 to 4, I think that's astonishing. Trent worked alongside Atticus Ross, fast becoming his most important musical collaborator, but he also worked with people like Alan Moulder, Alessandro Cortini, Adrian Belew. Interestingly, once Trent had agreed to do the Social Network soundtrack with Atticus for David Fincher, when they first watched a cut of it, part of that cut contained some of the tracks on Ghosts 1 to 4 as temp tracks, because they were exactly the sort of ambience and vibe that Fincher wanted for that film. The fragile beauty rubbing up against an undefined tension, almost like a gentle unease, that is a feeling that is kind of running through all of the Ghosts tracks, and also, as a consequence, the Social Network score as well. If you want an easy way to understand this record, or these 4 records, probably it's best to compare it to Aphex Twin's Selected Ambient Works Volume 2. You have, the shimmering drones and tender piano on a track like Two Ghosts, and that really revels in that beauty, or it basks in the tranquility that it creates, similar to 12 Ghosts as well. Whereas 6 Ghosts is using tuned percussion to create this skitterish sort of atmosphere, and it's sort of playfully strange in a way that makes you feel a little bit uneasy. The crunchy nastiness of 23 Ghosts with this bluesy riff mired in static. And we can't move on without mentioning 34 Ghosts, a track which begins with this banjo-led stripped back version of the track The Fragile, which was as you will definitely realize when you hear it. It was sampled by Lil Nas X on the track Old Town Road, and then descends into a far darker place, a cavern of deep, far away ambience. Could easily do an entire video on the Ghosts project, but alas, we must move on. We're only heading 2 months down the road now for the next release. Like, this is the same Trent Reznor that agonized over the sequencing of The Fragile, that took 6 years to follow that up as well. This is the same Trent Reznor, but now sober, hyper-focused, and ready to release another record. This one is called The Slip. This thing was made in 2 months front to back. That's 4 weeks writing, 3 weeks in the studio recording, and then 1 week mixing and mastering. Breakneck. It was also released for free online. And it's interesting, this kind of era, it was only a year after In Rainbows came out, where Radiohead did a pay what you want scheme on their website for that album. And it was an interesting time to be a music fan, because I was, so locked into buying CDs from Our Price and HMV and Virgin Megastore and places like that. It was always a big thing to go and buy a CD with whatever spare money I had. And then all of a sudden you had bands offering pay what you want albums, or in this instance, it was for free. Trent offered The Slip as an offering to fans who had supported them for all these years. And I'm like, this was a strange and exciting thing. Like, oh my God, I can download this album and listen to it for free. I don't have to go and buy it. Very strange, and actually quite archaic and funny now when you look back at it, considering where we are now with streaming and all the rest of it. On the site, there was this little note from Trent which said, "Thank you for your continued and loyal support over the years. This one's on me." Sonically, this record is this immensely crunchy collection of tracks, some real dancey numbers. Everything feels messy and organic sounding thanks to this quick live recording sound that they went for. What was inspiring was this kind of rule where we said, let's make it sound like garage electronics. Nothing gets fixed, there are no double takes, there's no tuning of vocals. Put mics on everything, nothing direct. We'd check those rules before we'd start a new song. Everything was done quickly, and it was fun. It's the most traditional rock band sound that Nine Inch Nails has done to this point, and it makes for a really satisfying listen. On True Opener 1 Million, the gallop of Josh Freese's live drums really fills the space. You get a proper sense that they are recording in a real room. Some of that room ambience really does come in, and it's helped by the fact that there isn't much stacking in the sounds. It really is just a trio of sounds. You've got guitar, drums, and Trent's vocals, and it's kind of that is it really. Once we hit the chorus, the space becomes much more filled, which is a really nice development to the track as it pushes on forward. On Discipline, the 4/4 drums evoke a disco vibe, this really tasty groove with a wiggy, treated guitar tone that snakes through every open hi-hat. Trent sings, "I need your discipline, I need your help, I need your discipline. Once I start, I cannot help myself." Maybe a touch of sadomasochism in there? It's not all one note though. Lights in the Sky is this elegant piano and whispered vocal piece, which as the darkness lurks in the chorus, it twists slightly and changes. A lovely piece. And what about Finale Demon Seed? A knotty programmed drum joins live drums, and then you have this foghorn-like bass synth which just powers through this scape. And the whole track is 6/4 anyway, which gives it that off-kilter feeling throughout. And there's so many excellent moments with the guitars on this track. At one point you have this kind of spicy walking guitar riff, and then after that you have this almost Cajun sounding riff that comes in. It all builds and builds and builds to this abrupt stop. And the record's over. This is short, sharp, quick to the point, messy, really cool. So after another extensive tour, it was time to put Nine Inch Nails back in the cupboard for a bit. Trent revealed on the Nine Inch Nails website that he was going to go and work on some other projects, and he would be kind of putting the band on hiatus for the time being. And this is where we get an outpouring of creativity in loads of other endeavours. Various Fincher film soundtracks, including the aforementioned The Social Network and Gone Girl. The theme music for Black Ops 3, anyone? An appearance on the brilliant Queens of the Stone Age record Like Clockwork. But never fear, because we were once again on the cusp of another Nine Inch Nails release. This time in September of 2013, released by Columbia Records, so back on a major label, just for this album, we get Hesitation Marks. On reflection, it's probably the most introspective and rhythmic record of the entire Nine Inch Nails canon. And all of that crunchy riffage and distortion, is largely gone, and what you're left with is something that sounds meticulously arranged. There's moments that have a lot of depth, there's warm textures and passages, the synth textures and the drums feel quite rounded and at times softer. A kind of off-color nauseating feeling creeps across this record. It's kind of hard to put your finger on exactly what it is, but it definitely feels very different to everything that came before it. Trent's talked about this in interviews, but some of what contributes towards this is a changing in dynamics in the songwriting and then the producing. So, you know, on that paranoid club beat of Copy of Her, you might expect as you reach towards the chorus, everything's going to get louder and more intense. But actually, it dips a little bit. Similarly, with third track Came Back Haunted, the queasiness of the track is somewhat resolved by the ambient pads and Trent's vocal melody of the chorus, but it isn't the typical add the layers approach that you were getting on records like Year Zero or with Teeth or even the pre-2000s output. Maybe it's a reaction to my work scoring films, which was all about texture and studies in different moods and ambiences and atmospheres. Rhythm sounded more interesting to me. That's the thing I really enjoy about this record. It's the rhythmic subtleties of it all. And, you know, it's not all on Trent either, even though, as usual, he is the primary sonic architect of this record. The track All Time Low was completely transformed because of the collaborators on the record. So what was initially quite a plodding electronic cut, which didn't sound particularly interesting, it was transformed when Pino Palladino, great bassist, and Adrian Belew, longtime collaborator, went to the studio and reinterpreted that track with Trent. And what we get in the end on this record is that sickly strutting groove. It's so good. Like the bass, the way the bass and the guitar works on that track absolutely makes it. And that's a result of Trent being able to work with collaborators and take on feedback and kind of not just be the one track mind, only person working on something. You get that staccato bass groove, which pretty much makes the track, to be honest, and then you have that clipped guitar riff from Adrian Belew and those ascending reverby guitar lines. Now, I do have to mention the elephant in the room: everything. And this track is like a summary slice of pop punk, complete with saccharine vocals in the verses, like backing vocals, and it's kind of catchy, yeah, but it does not belong on this record. It's always stuck out like a sore thumb to me. And if I'm listening to the record front to back, I will almost always skip it because it just takes me out of the atmosphere that's been crafted from the beginning. It just doesn't feel like it belongs there at all. What does belong is I Would For You, a late cut on the record, which has this excellent atmospheric guitar line from none other than Lindsey Buckingham. Yes, Lindsey Buckingham of Fleetwood Mac. So another collaborator coming on board and adding to Trent's sonic vision on this record. What's great is Hesitation Marks comes almost 25 years after the release of the debut album, Pretty Hate Machine, and it still sounds invigorated as a project. It's still doing its own thing. It's still carving out that unique Nine Inch Nails sound and feeling. And we're about to get even more of it. Before we jump into the trilogy of releases, there's a few other things that you could maybe check out. So there's a 2014 remix EP, which includes a version of Satellite by Hot Chip. Not for me. Recoiled, which is a load of tracks reworked by experimental band Coil, if you hadn't guessed by the title. And this is pretty fascinating stuff. They turn a load of Nine Inch Nails tracks into brooding collages of sound that pay only a passing resemblance to the originals. Check out the Downward Spiral. It's just fascinating to see how they work with sound. And also, you need to check out Coil anyway, because man, what a group. I'll do a video on them in the future. Then in 2016, we get a new release of original material from the band. What's different this time? Atticus Ross is now a full member of Nine Inch Nails, bringing the complete roster of full-time band members up to 2. Which is nice, considering he worked so closely with Trent on so many projects over the years, not just Nine Inch Nails, but like How to Destroy Angels, all of their soundtracks for film and TV and the rest of it. You know, they obviously know how to work together, so it made sense for that to happen. I won't go into it here, but I've linked to a video down below where Trent talks about the working relationship between him and Atticus and how it's almost symbiotic. Like, each person understands the way the other person works, and that makes the music making process so much smoother in general. So they clearly have a special thing going on there as collaborators. Back to the music. In 2016, we get Not the Actual Events, an EP that kicks off a series of releases that I think actually represents some of the most sonically creative music that Nine Inch Nails has ever released. bar perhaps the Ghosts project. But Ghost still sounds like a bit of an outlier to the Nine Inch Nails sound. Like, I think Ghost 1 to 4 sounds a lot like Nine Inch Nails, but it's very, very different in its execution. But these releases, starting with Not the Actual Events, they feel like Nine Inch Nails. They might be off-kilter, surprising and unusual, but like the essence of them is Nine Inch Nails, and the first time you hear it, you're going to think that. Unlike with Ghosts 1 to 4, where if you listen to it, you might think this is a prepared piano piece from an ambient artist or whatever. No, these are like DNA-wise Nine Inch Nails. Not the Actual Events was followed by Add Violence in 2017 and then Bad Witch in 2018, and there is a wealth of stuff here. Dear World is a breathy, moody track, and it has this mix of sequenced and live drums that interact nicely with the synth lines. She's Gone Away is an absolute belter. You're drenched in reverb to the point where it sounds like it was recorded in a fucking cave, you know, grumbling bass all over the place and these squealing, lacerating guitar lines. And that manic laugh in the chorus from Trent is so menacing, none more so than the version of the track that's nestled halfway in the middle of episode 8 of Twin Peaks: The Return. Honestly, it's the ultimate way to experience this track hidden in the middle of one of the most uncompromising episodes of TV ever aired. The riff of Burning Bright always sounds to me like an achingly slow version of Sweatloaf by Butthole Surfers, a deliciously nasty track. Less Than kicks off Add Violence. This is a track that wouldn't sound out of place on With Teeth. You have the live drums and then the sequence synths, and it sounds very classic Nine Inch Nails, and you have such a good sing-along chorus, and that's the bit that you're like, yeah, this could be on With Teeth. Funny story, when I saw them at Eden Project in 2022, they were playing this song, and at the end of the second verse when he sings, "And you can always justify the missile trails across the sky," he points behind everyone and goes, "A fucking rainbow." And then the full band jumps into the chorus, and it's just a really funny moment. And now I kind of wish that was on the studio version.
Yeah, a fucking rainbow.
This Isn't the Place is a track that dials down the intensity but ups the anxiety. You have this digital bass rumbling underneath, and then these glassy synths and pads reveling in the sparseness of the track, and the vocals are just this ghostly layer over the top. The Background Way, which closes out this release, starts as a fairly conventional track before it starts looping the same section over and over again, but it's not a perfect loop. It does this jump at the beginning of each loop, which kind of makes you jar as you're listening to it, but each time adds a layer of distortion, so the whole track's breaking down until there's nothing but digital noise. I've seen people suggest it might be inspired by William Basinski's The Disintegration Loops, which is a track which used analog tape to play a piece of music, but every time you run it through constantly, it starts to degrade more and more and more. I've actually seen Basinski play live where he does an ambient set and uses a loop of tape and does this live, and it's really cool to see. I'll talk more about Basinski in a future video. Final release, Bad Witch, kicks off with Shit Mirror, which is this fuzzy, punky mess of a track that has these fairly incongruous hand claps in it. And there's something about the production of this track which makes it feel quite oppressive. You know, all the fuzz of the bass and the distortion on the vocals, it's very in your face. They continue to play with degradation and distortion on the track Play the Goddamn Part with this drum loop that's bit crushed to death, and there's this horrible delay on it that just makes the beat wonky as hell. On top of that are these discordant sax lines that get layered on top of each other over and over again. Last track, Over and Out, begins like one of the garage electronic-y sounds from something like The Slip, but by the end is transformed into this floating, beatless thing of beauty. It's brilliant that these three releases display so much willingness to be creative, push the bar out, you know, the willingness to experiment with your sound. Because, you know, bands that have been around for, at this point, nearly 30 years, don't always want to do that. They're not always willing to go right outside of their comfort zones, but also make something that sounds like them. That's quite a hard thing to do, but that's what's so great about these three releases, and that's why they deserve your time just as much as the well-known records, you know, Downward Spiral, Fragile, With Teeth, Year Zero, all the rest of them. Like, this deserves your time just as much, these three releases. So we get another world tour from the group after these releases come out, and then, of course, COVID hits. It's a shitty time. There's no need to dwell on any of it. We've all collectively dwelled on it plenty over the past half decade. You know, it is what it is. The pandemic compels Trent and Atticus to release two things in one hit: Ghosts 5 Together and Ghosts 6 Locusts. There's a proper duality to this release, even down to the artwork. Together is wall-to-wall beautiful, and it's really sort of showing the pair flexing their muscles in terms of the ambience that they created on all those different soundtracks over the years since 2010. Poignant pads, lovely 5-note piano motifs like on Letting Go While Holding On, which will just run through your head hours after you first listen to it. And Locusts is it's not that. It's pretty grim and unsettling. It notches up the tension with sparing piano sounds and alien digital noises, like on that opening track, The Cursed Clock. There are moments that come close to brushing the beauty of the tracks on together, like the closing minutes of A Very Bad Night, but just as you think that that's where they're going with it, in the end you're left with this unnerving wash of unidentifiable sounds. They're kind of all stalking somewhere in the back of your ears. They're interesting projects, but to me they're not really Nine Inch Nails projects. You know, they sound much more akin to the scoring work that Trent and Atticus have done since The Social Network onwards. And as such, for me, I think the last full Nine Inch Nails release really was Bad Witch. But what do I know, right? Maybe this just is the next natural progression of the Nine Inch Nails project, a project that's never stayed in stasis, that began embracing the darkness of metallic industrial sounds and flirted with dance music, elevated concepts using alternate reality, released music for free at a time where that was anathema, moved on to garage electronic sounds, and then started mixing much more deep electronic textures into their music. And coming up, we're getting the Nine Inch Nails score for Tron Ares. I mean, what does that actually mean? We've never had a score from Nine Inch Nails. We've had scores from Trent and Atticus, but not under the Nine Inch Nails moniker. And it's just another change for this ever-evolving musical project. And personally, I would not have it any other way. And that's it. That's my deep cuts guide to Nine Inch Nails. If you're still watching, well done. This was a really long video. Thanks so much for sticking with me. What a brilliant band. There's so much to talk about. Do drop into the comment section. Let me know your favorite Nine Inch Nails records, projects, whatever. I'll be back next month with another deep cuts video. In the meantime, I'm on Substack posting every single week. Come along, read my posts, discover the interviews I've been doing, recommendations, and all the rest of it. Thanks as always for supporting this channel. See you soon.